series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Tension went high, but negotiations stopped the greater danger.
None other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose.
But the US embargo was tightened in 1962, accusing Cuba of being on the Soviet bloc. But till now, that inhuman blockade is ongoing. The US embargo of Cuba has dramatically harmed the health and nutrition of large numbers of ordinary Cuban citizens. The embargo has prohibited ships from loading or unloading cargo in US ports for 180 days after delivering cargo to Cuba. This provision has strongly discouraged shippers from delivering medical equipment to Cuba. Consequently, shipping costs have risen dramatically and further constricted the flow of food, medicine, medical supplies, and even gasoline for ambulances. The Foreign Minister of the Republic of Cuba, Pérez Roque, called the embargo an act of genocide. Till today, numerous Pentagon attempts have failed to doom the socialist Cuba. The Dominican Republic is another small country in Latin America. Leftist Juan Bosch defeated the repressive Rafael Trujillo government in 1962 elections. He took various initiatives to aid national interest. The Pentagon did not like it and helped organize a military coup there. Protests were flamed out in the country. A civil war started. The Pentagon went with Operation Power Pack, the operation to uproot Juan Bosch government. In 1966, the Pentagon ensured a pro-US Joaquin Belayu's government to be in the power. Pro-US governments were also established in Iran, Chile, Guatemala and Indonesia during the Cold War, according to the design of the Pentagon. Iranian elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh took initiative to nationalize the oil fields in 1953. The Americans and the Allies were furious, and so the Pentagon started Operation Ajax. But an attempted coup plan from the American consulate in Tehran failed.
Mossadegh verstaatlichte anschließend die Ölfelder und verweigerte British Petroleum das Monopol. Die Geschichtsabteilung des CIA unter CIA.gov beschreibt detailliert:
In 1954, the Pentagon played a direct role to eradicate an elected government by military coup in Guatemala. But they had learned a good lesson while invading Vietnam, a poor country of Indochina. The country had been long fighting French colonial oppression. Even after the World War II, the French tried to keep the land in its control. But a glorious guerrilla resistance started under the leadership of communists. The Pentagon aided France with money and arms then. But when France was near to accept the defeat, the Pentagon could not help start an invasion. It started to move military force. Communists of North Vietnam were fighting pro-US governments in South Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. The Pentagon leaped forward with arms to annihilate them. They left no brutality to show there. Civil areas were devastated by carpet bombing. Chemical poisons had been spread over the crops field to create scarcity of rice and starvation. Vandalism went all over the country. 20 million Vietnamese had been killed. The most brutal act was seen in My Lai mass murder in 1968. Over 2 million people were killed in the war, including 55,000 US troops. America faced protests against the war in its own country and shot 12 people dead. The Pentagon aided the killing force of Cambodia with all possible measures. In 1970, Salvador Allende, socialist leader, came to power in Chile. The country was advancing to economic stability quite smoothly under his wise leadership. Steps like nationalizing heavy industries, land reform programs had very positive impact. The Pentagon did not like that. Every attempt was made under Operation Fewbold to create an unstable situation in the country using the CIA. Success came to them with General Pinochet after 2 failed coup attempts. The coup directed by the Pentagon in 1973 left thousands of dead bodies of leftist workers. Millions of them were detained. Assassination of President Allende was accomplished by dropping bombs on the president's palace. Then, the Pinochet government created a free land of massacre. State terrorism demonstrated the ugliest face in Chile with indulgence from the Pentagon. 1971. Pentagon actively took part against our glorious freedom struggle, aiding arsenals to Pakistan. A brave role from the Soviet Union helped to terminate many of its conspiracy plans, like sending warships. They had to admit defeat of Pakistan but did not rest from making secret plots. Local collaborators were found out to overthrow the Sheikh Mujib government. Echoes of Vietnam reverberated in Central America during the 80s, when the Reagan administration strongly backed the pro-US regime in El Salvador. Salvadorian civilians questioned the concentration of power and wealth in a few hands. Rightist death squads slaughtered Salvadorian protesters with the help of the Pentagon. In Nicaragua, new leftist Sandinista government was in power. That also made the Pentagon discontented. CIA-trained Nicaraguan Contra-rebels launched terrorist attacks against civilian clinics and schools run by the Sandinista government and mined Nicaraguan harbors. US troops also invaded the island nation of Grenada in 1983 to oust a new military regime. Previously, a mass upsurge put the revolutionary leader Maurice Bishop into power in 1979. The Pentagon, having a vow to act against pro-people forces anywhere, began acting to overthrow Bishop. At last, managed to organize a counter-revolutionary coup by the Assistant Prime Minister. US Marines invaded the country in support of the military government. They made the world conscience confounded, bombing on a hospital there. After 1951, a number of countries were brought under military rule with direct plans and programs by the Pentagon. These countries were Benin between 1963-64, 65-68, 69 and 70, 72 to 87. Burkina Faso in 1966-70 and 80 to 1991. Burundi between 1966 to 1987. Chad 1975 to 1978. Congo between 1968 to 1979. Egypt 1952 to 1958. Guinea 1979 to 1987. Ethiopia between 1974 to 1987. Ghana between 1966 to 1970 and from 1972 to 1979. Madagascar between 1972 to 1975 and then again between 1977 to 1991. Mali between 1968 to 1976, 1991 to 1992. Mauritania between 1978 to 1992. Niger between 1974 to 1989. Nigeria between 1966 to 1979. Rwanda between 1973 to 1975. Sierra Leone between 1967 and 68. Somalia between 1969 to 1976, Sudan between 1958 to 64, and then again 1969 to 86, Togo 67 to 1969, Uganda 1971 to 1979, Argentina to 1966 to 73, and then 76 to 1983, Bolivia 1964 to 1996 and 1969 to 1979, Brazil 1964 to 1985, Chile 1973 to 1990, Colombia 1953 to 1958, Cuba 1952 to 54, Ecuador between 63 and 1966, 1972 and 1979, El Salvador 1944 to 1980, Guatemala 1963 to 1966 and 1970 to 1986, Haiti 1950 to 1956, Honduras 1963 to 1965, 1972 to 1982, Nicaragua 1950 to 1956, 1967 to 1979, Panama 1968 to 1989, Paraguay 1954 to 1993, Peru 1962 to 63, 1968 to 1980, Venezuela 1935 to 1959, Myanmar 1962 to the present time, Cambodia 1969 to 1975, Indonesia 1967 to 68, Iran 1953 to 57, and then again 1978 to 79, Iraq 1949 to 1950, 52 to 53, 1958 to 1979, South Korea 1961 to 63 and 1980 to 81, Laos to 1959 to 1960, Pakistan 1958 to 1971, Syria 1951 to 54, 63 to 1972, Thailand 1948 to 1973, 1976 to 1992, South Vietnam 1963 to 1975, North Yemen 1962 to 1978, Greece 1967 to 1974, Portugal 1968 to 1976, and Turkey 1960 to 1961. The US returned in force to the Middle East in 1980. Shiite Muslim revolution in Iran overthrew Sheikh Pahlavi's pro-US dictatorship. After the 1982 Israeli occupation of Lebanon, US Marines were deployed in a neutral peacekeeping operation, but peace was just a word to them. Instead, they took the side of Lebanon's pro-Israel Christian government against Muslim rebels. If an onshore attack continued, US Navy ships rained enormous shells on Muslim civilian villages to drown those under blood. Embittered Shiite Muslim rebels responded with a suicide bomb attack on Marine barracks. In retaliation, the CIA set off car bombs. But Syria and the Muslim rebels emerged victorious in Lebanon. The Pentagon launched a bombing raid on Libya in 1986. Libya was accused of sponsoring a terrorist bombing later tied to Syria. The bombing raid killed hundreds of civilians. But in spite of so much atrocities, Gaddafi remained firm in his position. The Pentagon instigated the war between Iran and Iraq. The US took Iraq's side in the war. Its intention was clear: subduing the disobedient Iran. That intention let Pentagon forget that they had blacklisted Iraq as a patronizer of terrorists previously in 1979. US Navy attacked Iran on behalf of Iraq in 1987 and 88. An American naval warship patrolling in the Persian Gulf had shot down an Iranian passenger jet after apparently mistaking it for an F-14 fighter. All those on board the airliner, almost 300 people, are believed dead. Pentagon forces invaded Panama in 1989. The mission was to oust the nationalist regime of Manuel Noriega. He was accused by former ally Pentagon of allowing drug running in the country. When coup attempts failed, the Pentagon decided to act on their own. US bombing raids on Panama City ignited a conflagration in a civilian neighborhood fed by stove gas tanks. Over 2,000 Panamanians were killed in the invasion to capture one leader. The following year, the Pentagon deployed forces in the Persian Gulf after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Saddam Hussein, former Iraqi ally, turned into villain for the Pentagon. US supported the Kuwaiti monarchy and the Muslim fundamentalist monarchy in neighboring Saudi Arabia against the secular nationalist Iraqi regime. In January 1991, the US and its allies unleashed a massive bombing assault against Iraqi government and military targets in intensity beyond the raids of World War II. Blood flowed through the country. Up to 200,000 Iraqis were killed in the war. But bombing was not all. Imposed economic sanctions denied health and energy to Iraqi civilians. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis faced death from that sanction, according to the United Nations agencies. Under President Reagan in the 1980s, the United States stepped up the use of military power for the political and economic aims of imperialism. In the confrontation with the Soviet Union, the Pentagon was turned into a godlike powerful institution. When the historic fall of the Soviet Union took place, the Cold War had finished its part. Fighting communism was not a big issue existing anymore. But the Pentagon warmongers cannot live without war and expansion. They came up with newer plans to be the supreme power and not letting any rise of any rival. Conspiracies went on, especially targeting the energy-rich countries. The end of the Soviet Union did not lead to any substantial reduction of US defense expenditure or the strength of the armed forces or its armament stock. The US defense budget for the year 2000 is proposed to be $281 billion. The US defense budget for the year 2000 is proposed to be $281 trillion, which is more than the combined military expenditure of 6 other countries with the biggest military budgets: Russia, Britain, France, Germany, and China. The number increased from year to year. The first indication of the new orientation of US military strategy came with the Gulf War in 1991. In the attack on Iraq, the coalition led by the United States consisted of Britain, Germany, Japan, and other allied powers, with America providing the main equipment and fighting force. The use of high-tech weaponry for aerial bombing, missile attacks, and crippling the enemy's air and ground defenses indicated how the United States would use its economic, technological, military superiority to cow down or destroy potential enemies or threats. The military doctrine enunciated after the collapse of the Soviet Union stated that the threat would now come from regional powers. It was told that they had the capacity for substantial strength in conventional weapons and armed forces. Who are those regional forces? No one but such powers who did not